start everyone.
Honorable Chief Patron, Founder and Chancellor Professor Syed Wasim Akhtar Sir, Patron and Pro-Chancellor Professor Syed Nadeem Akhtar Sir, Vice Chancellor Professor Javed Musarrar Sir, Registrar Professor Haris Siddiqui Sir, Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Shahid Ali Khan Sir, Head of the Department of Languages, Dr. H.M. Arif Nadvi Sir, faculty members and dear participants. A very warm good afternoon to one and all. I am Dr. Arina with my partner Ms. Vanya Srivastav, welcoming you to this online international faculty development program on emerging trends in English literature, organized by the Department of Languages Integral University, Lucknow. As you know, that this international faculty development program have great and eminent learned academicians from various universities of India and world. They will enrich the eminent faculty members that are esteemed past participants with their unending knowledge and experiences till 2 weeks through the platform of Integral University, situated in Lucknow, a city known for its culture, heritage, and monuments. Talking about Integral University, it has a unique culture of inclusiveness, diversity, intellectual integrity, and value based education. The curriculum has a strong focus on individual growth and the development of essential tools so that its students make a mark in the corporate world in the field of technology and academics. This program organized through the Department of Languages at improving the faculty's perception of values and education, increasing motivation and enthusiasm for transforming knowledge and disseminating knowledge of literature. It is a comprehensive development program and an imperative for every institution. English literature has faced unparalleled change since its existence. It has passed through all ages, surviving and flourishing richly. In the present time of cybernetics, it is under constant redefinition and reformation. It is functioning as an equalizer between diverse culture, languages, worldviews, and ethos. The present faculty development program aims to explore not only the new trends but also the re-alteration of various existing dimensions of English literature. It aims to explore, dissect, and understand the changing face of literature. With the purpose of enhancing knowledge about the current trends in English literature of faculty members, whose effective interaction is a vital ingredient for advancing the transformation of multidimensional appeal of literature. Our today's guest speaker is Professor Manojit Mandal, Department of English, Jadavpur University. In this respect, I would like to request Dr. Arshi Khan to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Manojit Mandal. Dr. Arshi Khan, please, you start your session.
Highly inspired and invigorated by this endeavor of the Department of
program on emerging trends in English literature. I feel highly privileged and fortunate, I would say, to have this opportunity of welcoming our guest speaker for today's program, Professor Manojit Mandal. Dr. Mandal is a professor in English and a joint coordinator of the Center of Studies in Cultural Diversity and Well-being and Center for Studies in Society and Religion at Jadavpur University. He has a specialization in Shakespeare in Bengal, Rabindranath Tagore, cultural studies, disability studies, research and higher education policy. He has a certification in both UGC NET and UGC JRF and a teaching experience of 18 years. Professor Mandal has supervised various educational projects like special education and research on disability studies, education and awareness among persons with disability in the suburban areas, and education and awareness among persons with disability in the north, and many more. He has his paper presentations in 14 national and 26 international conferences. Professor Mandal has various fellowships to his name, to say a few: UGC Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan Visitorship, English Department, Texas University; UGC Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan Visitorship, English Department, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong; and UGC Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan Visitorship, English Department, NIT, Goa. Sir, we are highly honored to have you with us today. On behalf of Integral University, welcome you to this venture to solicit your views. Welcome, sir.
Oh, I could not thank you more for that kind introduction, Dr. Rashid Khan. It is customary again to thank the organizer of this fascinating program, the Department of Languages, Integral University. I believe it's a very new fledgling university which is growing up quite leaps and bounds in that part of the country, which I think is at times known for all the bad reasons. Uh, Having said that, I really thank you, Dr. Arina, for your persuasion. The Dean of Humanities, Dr. Khan, the Vice Chancellor, Chancellor, and the Department of Languages, the faculty, Ms. Srivastava, all of you are fantastic for organizing this program. But I must start with an apology because I was supposed to deliver this lecture quite late at the event, and suddenly I was thrusted into doing this. So it would be some kind of an unprepared lecture that I'll be delivering. I had thought of probably saying so many things, but we won't be able to because of the fact that I cannot get proper time to prepare the lecture. Nonetheless, whatever I'm going to say, the topic is already known to all of you: reimagining nationhood, English studies, nationalism, and contemporary India. Uh, I, I would like to uh, rather again begin with the caveat that my lecture might provoke uh, many discussions, including some contentious issues about what is happening in contemporary India, keeping in mind the idea of what, how, and which way the nation is being again reimagined or redefined. So that will also be part of my lecture. So the caveat is there. At times, the lecture would definitely appear to be political, but uh, political and the literary, I think, are completely interwoven, as there are innumerable studies. In fact, I am right now sitting with a book that is written by or edited by Meenakshi Mukherjee and others. This book is called Nation in Imagination, uh, essays on nationalism, sub-nationalism, and narration, where in the beginning of that particular book, they are making it amply clear that the political and the aesthetic are now highly interwoven. The relation between nation and imagination, however, is complex and complicated, and has therefore attracted sustained critical engagement. And they're saying and raising these questions: is nation a mere figment of imagination? Is it imagination that conjures up nation, or it's nation that inspires imagination? Is nation constructed by narration, or does narration presuppose the existence of nation? How is nation conceived variously through narratives? What factors shape the grand narratives of nation, and how do these get deconstructed in counter discourse? how subjectivities of writers impact the narratives of nation. These are the few questions with which this very uh, popular book by Minakshi Mukherjee and others begins. And my point of contention begins at that particular issue, whether and how nation should be imagined, or what is the role of imagination in narrating nation. Now, the connection between literature and nationalism, or again, the connection between literature and nation in this part of the world, in India, I think is quite well known to all of us. In fact, uh, let me again quote a very famous line from W.B. Yeats, where he says that there is no great nationality without literature, and vice versa, there is no great literature without nationality. This he said in one of his letters. So meaning that there is no great literature without nationality, and there is no great nationality without literature. Again, making the highly, sort of, inseparable connection between nation and literature. Similarly, in case of India, and we know that, I mean, what Yeats was doing in Ireland, I think was quite well known to all of us, that he was trying to construct Ireland as a nation when it was fighting the colonial rule in much the same line that we had in India uh, towards the end of 19th century, and it continued throughout the 20th century. Now, in case of India as well, all of you perhaps know, since all of you are teachers, that nation building and the idea of nationalism started to gain momentum in the middle of the 19th century. Incidentally, that was the period when English studies in India was also gaining huge momentum. All of you know how it started. It started with the foundation of a very famous college in India nearly 200 years ago, in the form of Hindu College in 1817. Uh, and English literary, that is the beginning of what we are doing today, English literary studies, both language and literature. I believe this is a language department, and I am not really familiar with the curriculum that you offer. But since I am talking about the broad subject of English studies, I'll talk about the role of English studies in forming India as a nation, or making us imagine India as a nation. Now, what happened in the middle of the 19th century, and how this idea of India was gradually being conceived of uh, by the greats of Indian literature. And mind you, they were not the conventional politicians. They were largely men of literature. It started off with one very famous novelist, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, in 1860s, and then in 1880s with his very famous and highly controversial book Anandamot. But before I move on to all those issues, I mean, let me talk about how this idea of nation was actually conceived of, and what was the inspiration behind that. And that, of course, will lead us to the beginning of English literary studies once again. Though it started formally in Hindu College, with the establishment of Hindu College in 1817, but it was very powerfully institutionalized by Thomas Babington Macaulay in 1835. Again, all of you know. And Macaulay's, I think, motive was quite well known. He did not really want to have a people who will sort of have counter discourse on the idea of nationalism. He wanted to create a group of insipid Indian intellectuals, famously known as Brown Sahibs, who will be a kind of conduit between the colonizers and the vast contingent of Indian people, the colonized. Okay, that was the motive of Macaulay when he was formally establishing English education in India. Of course, by doing away with the vernacular system of education, he and all of you know how famously said that Arabic, Bengali, Sanskrit, Persian, they must be abolished because they are all useless languages and learning, and only English language must be introduced along with, of course, English literary study. But what happened? Did he really succeed entirely, or there was something else to the topic, or there was something else to the game that Macaulay was trying to play? That will be the pivotal aspect of my lecture. We have got one side of the story, that English literature and English language are largely used as tools of empire, as weapons of hegemony, weapons of this, dominance. That was, of course, one side of the story. But the other side of the story is that the English language and literature at the same time inspired us to construct India as a nation as well. And that was the game that the colonizers, perhaps someone like Macaulay or his brother in law, Trevelyan, did not want. That the Indians who are being taught, who are being trained to become brown sahibs, like someone like Michael Madhusudan Dotto, Dakshin Ranjan Bandyopadhyay, and there are plenty of such brown sahibs produced because of English literary studies. And of course, the hub of that, what should I say, production house would be Hindu College, later known as the Presidency College. Okay, but the game that Macaulay and his followers, including of course the colonial administration, wanted to play was actually challenged by the Indian intelligentsia themselves. In many ways, they beat the colonizers in their own game when they started to construct India as a nation. And this was done, as I said, this was done not by conventional politicians, but by men of literature. Most of them were, mind you, English educated intellectuals, starting with Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay himself, who incidentally was taught in the same college that I was mentioning, the same iconic college, the Hindu College. So this is the crux of my lecture that I would like to begin with, and then move on to the contemporary world and how the role of English studies in now sort of reimagining or reconstructing India that is going on in many controversial ways. I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end of my lecture. First, let us come to this point, how English literary studies began to inspire the Indian writers, Indian thinkers, Indian intellectuals in narrating, in constructing India as a nation, India as a distinct identity. And that is, of course, as many of you will argue, that is fraught with the tremendous paradox. Though these people were products of English literary studies, they were reading Shakespeare, they were reading Milton, Byron, they were reading the Romantics. At the same time, they were trying to fight the colonizers, perhaps the descendants of Shakespeare, Milton's, and many others. This is the paradox that the 19th century Indian nationalism is all about. On the one hand, someone like Bankim Chandra can talk about Shakespeare's Tempest as a classic text, which is far superior than our own Kalidas's Shakuntala. But on the other hand, the same man is also talking about India as a nation, or rather, beginning the idea of India as a nation. On the one hand, someone like Hemchandra Bandyopadhyay, again a very well-known intellectual in this part of the world, was taught in the Hindu college. On the one hand, he can talk about Shakespeare's greatness. Shakespeare is greatest and Kalidas is greater. Kalidas is an inferior writer, without really understanding the cultural dichotomy in stating this, that you are actually demeaning your national icon. Actually, you are, privileging an icon which is imported directly from the colonizer's kitty, which who was introduced on the one hand with a specific purpose of teaching the natives English, but also on the other hand to create the ideology of the empire. And there is no denying the fact that after innumerable studies done by Gauri Vishwanathan, Ania Lumba, Jyotsna Singh, and so on and so forth, that English literary studies, I think, would be one of the principal cultural tools in forming the ideology of the empire. And that was one part of the story. Of course, I begin with that. I mean, it is there. But the other part of the story that most of these writers are glossing over is that how that, that itself, that English literary studies itself became an inspiration for the educated English intelligentsia of 19th century India, led obviously by Bengal, because Bengal used to be the cultural and political capital or political hub of India, British Empire at that point of time. How those, in English intelligentsia would be gradually becoming self-righteous, engaged in self-definition of their motherland. It started off with Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. It started off with a very famous and controversial play by Dinobandhu Mitro, Indigo Mirror, knowing in Bangla as Neel Darpan. They are the first early, writings about India's nationalism, which you had in the middle of the 19th century. And incidentally, I repeat, if you look at their studies, look at their knowledge, look at their learnings, all of them were English educated intellectuals. Okay, so the point that I wish to make here is that, though the colonizers wanted to, in a sense, beat us in their game, in the game of creating almost a spineless intellectual. Of course, there are plenty of such spineless intellectuals throughout the 19th century, and most of them, in fact, later on would be part of the formation which is known as Indian National Congress, and it's very highly controversial way the Indian National Congress was, sort of created, uh, uh, though it was conceived of in 1882, again by an Englishman. All of you know that Alan Octavian Hume, how he conceived of a kind of pan-Indian umbrella to somewhat not really to fight the colonizers, but to become a kind of channel between the government, the British government, and the people, British government and the people of India. So it was his brainchild, and I think I believe that there were reasons why Hume wanted to have this kind of affirmation. You know, many of you might be knowing that Hume was serving the East India Company as a part of the British Army when the first war of independence, which is mistakenly known as Sipa Mutiny, took place in 1857. He was serving in Meerut, in fact, in your part of the country. He was posted in Meerut, and he was really shocked to find that the natives were rebelling. He wanted to have a kind of congenial atmosphere between the rulers and the ruled. So he was shocked to find how this bloody rebellion took place in 1857, and incidentally thereafter, all of you know that India formally became part of the British Empire, and we were directly taken over by the British government. So he had this in mind that if this way it continues, and the reasons were obvious. The reasons were again, how we were, in a sense, disturbed in terms of their identity, in terms of our own identity, religious identity, largely Sipa Mutiny, or what I or many of us would like to call as First War of Independence. It was triggered off because of an identity crisis among the Sipai, among the armies, among the Indian contingent of the army people. So obviously, that was built again on religious identity. That our identity would be, brutally tampered with by the British policy. That we were, supposed to wear certain kind of a dress, which will definitely interfere with our, religious beliefs. So he understood that if this way it continued, I mean, it would be very difficult for the British Empire to sustain in India for a long period of time. So what we needed, Hume imagined that there has to be a kind of complementary kind of collaboration between the colonizers and the colonized, and that has to happen through a pan-Indian formation. And before, prior to establishment of Indian National Congress in 1885, it was formally founded in 1885 with the Bombay Congress. Uh, he wanted to have this kind of formation because many others, like Indian, what you know as Indian Mahasabha and Indian Sabha, they were fighting the British colonizers. Obviously, incidentally, Indian Mahasabha would be led by Asian Banerjee, one of the leading nationalists of the time. Once again, English educated nationalist Surendranath Banerjee, quite well known to all of you. So what he understood, Alan Octavian Hume, that uh, there has to be a kind of pan-Indian formation. And incidentally, when he was delivering a lecture in the University of Calcutta in 1882, again during a convocation series in Calcutta University, he proposed this kind of a formation in 1882, which was materialized 3 years later in 1885 with him being the first president of Indian National Congress. And thereafter, I think you name any great nationalist, at times writers, including our national poet, very own Rabindranath Tagore, some of the other became part of the Indian National Congress. Uh, all of you know that Tagore, though formally took off the job of Indian National Congress in 1908 as the president of Bengal Provincial Congress, but Tagore had an uninterrupted connection with the Indian National Congress from 1886, when the first session of Congress was held in Calcutta. From 1886 to 1908, Tagore and his family almost had an uninterrupted connection with the Indian National Congress. They would be donating, they would be participating in the Congress sessions, which would be held in Calcutta. And at times, as you know, that during the anti-partition agitation, which in fact was the first major nationalist movement in India, it was not any political person that was leading that agitation, but Tagore himself was the leader of that anti-partition agitation. And this was said not by me, but a very famous historian, Sumit Sarkar, in his doctoral dissertations called Swadeshi Samaj in Swadeshi movement in Bengal. Sumit Sarkar is making it amply clear that the anti-partition agitation, which was the first major nationalist movement against the British in India, was led not by any conventional politician, but by Tagore himself. And we all know the kind of role that he played. Again, it was uh, an agitation, it was a movement to protest against the division of India in communal life. All of you know that it was the brainchild of Mr. Lord Curzon. He started to divide both the Bengals, not just on religious line, but also on linguistic ground. So again, you played the counter identity politics to counter the identity politics or identity, tampering of our identity by the colonizer. It began, as I told you, in the hands of this great writer and thinker. Many of us might not be aware of Tagore's political career. Tagore did have a vibrant political career. As I mentioned, that he took up the job of becoming the provincial head of the Bengal Congress. Can't even imagine the kind of Congress that we have in today's India, the provincial Congress or the Congress Party. They were the great men, whether it's Tagore, whether it is, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. He would be attending some of the sessions, though not directly till 1893, till his death in 1894. So these are the nationalists of the time, and you could rarely make the distinction between the politicians, the actual nationalists, and the writers. And in most of the cases, whether the nationalist starting from S.N. Banerjee, Dadabhai Nauroji, or even Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they were all educated in what we are doing today, what we are studying today in English literature. But did that deter them to fight the colonizers? Did that deter them to understand India as a nation? And this, in a sense, collaboration between the writers and the actual politicians, at that point of time, of course, politicians would not be the kind of term of hatred that we normally associate in today's India. Politics at that point of time was really politics in true sense of the term. you know the politicians would be educated, would be really concerned about their motherland. uh, Even if they fight among themselves, the fight would be, of course, at times it went up to a bitter fight in 1907 when we had the Surat Congress, Aurobindo Ghosh, Bal Gangadhar Tilak on the one hand, and Asian Banerjee and Dadabhai Nauroji on the other hand. uh, but nevertheless, it was for a cause. The cause was, of course, whether you want to fight the British with arms or whether you want to fight the British with your pen, by petitioning, by writing, by appealing to them. I think this was the most contentious issue throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, how the colonizers would be fought. But as I repeat, you know, the inspiration of that fight, the idea of that fight would be mooted first by the writers. I come back to Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. All of you might be aware of the fact that the novel that Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay first wrote was in English. Okay, it was known as Rajmohan's Wife, published in 1891. As I come back to English studies from little bit of uh, political history of late 19th century India. Incidentally, novel was really a new genre to us, the Indians. We did not have any idea about this particular form of writing, novel. And by the time we had it in India in 1861, uh, pioneered by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. In England, novel, I think all of you know, since you are students of English literature, you are followers of English literature. By the time Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay started to adopt this form in India, it was already 150 years old in England. And you know that how the novels was being written in England at that point of time, in the middle of the 19th century. I think this was the age of uh, a novel in many ways. I mean, you had all the great writers writing novels, starting from Charles Dickens to Thomas Hardy and all others. But then why Bankim Chandra felt the urge of adopting this colonial form? Let us call it a colonial form, because novel was invented by the English in the beginning of the 18th century. If you call Robinson Crusoe's as the pioneer of novel, not exactly technically a full-fledged novel. Many people argue that the first full-fledged technical novel, all of you know that, again, in a stupid lesson of English literature, Pamela, 1741. But many people argue that this is perhaps the beginning of novel, the age of novel in the beginning of 18th century. So novel was a colonial form, and it was, in many ways, it was uh, the result of the beginning of colonization as well. Or I should be saying how novel writing in England is actually complementing, or in many senses, inspiring colonial enterprises. You see, and if you go to the middle of the 19th century, I mean, many people argue that this is the great age of liberalism, the great age of novels, great age of liberalism. Uh, you have people like Stuart Mill, people like Charles Dickens, and many others. But Edward Said has argued in quite persuasively so, in his book Culture and Imperialism, that this was also the age of high imperialism, where Britain almost became an unchallengedly supreme colonial power. And by the end of 19th century, Edward Said argues, and with statistics, that by the end of 19th century, the Britain would be colonizing almost 70% of the earth, right? So in the 19th century, on the one hand, at home is known as the age of liberalism. You had great people like John Stuart Mill talking about subjection of women. You had great writers like Charles Dickens talking about the working class. You had greats like Karl Marx settling in England in 1851, talking about the working class movement. You had great like Engels, and name anyone. I mean, all the known liberals, but none of them, and this is amazing, none of them is talking about what their compatriots are doing in the colonies, especially in India, in Africa. None of them are concerned about that, as if were colonization was almost a kind of birthright, you know. So on the one hand, you are talking about the working class movement, their liberation, the liberation of women at home. But on the other hand, what your compatriots are doing in India, in Africa, you remain almost silent. Rather, you are contributing to formation of that ideology. I mean, if you read the novels of great Charles Dickens, invariably all the criminals will go to either India or Australia. Read the novels. In fact, many people argue that when England started to construct themselves as a nation, it was done way back in the beginning of the 17th century in the hands of the mighty Shakespeare himself. There are innumerable examples of how Shakespeare is trying to construct England as a distinct nation. And I think, again, I refer to one very interesting book by Anya Lumba, Shakespeare, Race and Colonialism. In her introduction, she is making it amply clear why the English people needed a kind of enterprise known as colonization. They needed it to survive. They needed it to feed themselves. So it was not just uh, colonization, it was a kind of business or revenue earning enterprise for them. And therefore, whether the liberals or the conservatives, whether the great writers or the great politicians like Edmund Burke, they will all remain silent about what their compatriots are doing in India throughout the 19th century, what you know as the great or high age of empire, or where the empire, I think, reached an almost an unchallenged supreme position as far as British Empire is concerned. Of course, decline started to take place since 1890s, all of you know. So now come back to the idea of novel. So why Bankim Chandra was adopting this form? Now he could understand that almost in the similar line as the English novelist, early English novelist would try to understand, that to define yourself, to define your nation, you need a different kind of a form. Poetry, drama, essays are not really adequate enough to define yourself, to construct England as a nation. So they had to invent this new form, and also to cater to the new audience, new readers, newly educated class. So it started in England with the idea of constructing England as a formidable nation, and it started to become almost a nation since the beginning of 18th century, and throughout the 18th century. After the French Revolution, it became a distinct nation, all of you know. But the process, I repeat, the process started with Shakespeare himself, when Shakespeare started to write in his own language, or talking about all Englishness, hailing England as motherland, especially in one of his plays, Edward Said, even to a large extent in the great tragedy of King Lear. England became the epicenter of this particular tragedy, King Lear. So, Shakespeare is perhaps initiating the process. It is becoming complete by the end of 18th century, when you already had this form called novel. And in the hands of the 19th century novelist, I think England became an unchallengedly supreme power by contributing to the building up of the empire itself, forming the ideology of the empire. And this is again, the argument is not given by me, but this argument is given by Edward Said in his book Culture and Imperialism, which came out in the 1993. So Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, look at how he's adopting that colonial form to question the colonizers themselves. First, started off writing in English. Of course, that was a disaster move. He could understand very well that this is not his language. He needed to come to his own language. He needed to come to his mother tongue. And Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay was never happy with his first novel written in English, Rajmohan's Wife. And the next one would be the tremendously popular one, Devi Chaudhurani, all of you know, and then Kapal Kundala and so on and so forth. But interestingly, the form was a colonial form. And of course, it's ending with the highly controversial but very significant one, Anandamot, probably in 1882, if my memory is serving me right. So Anandamot, I think, is the first full-fledged novel where a structured sense of India was created. Maybe quite controversial in today's context, but if you think about that particular context in which it was written, it was a very significant attempt by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay to construct India as a nation. Okay, so started up with the colonial form, adopting the colonial form, starting off with the colonial language, immediately adopting his own mother tongue. But very interestingly, the influence of English literary studies and English literature would be replete with even his Bangla novels. We have seen how Kapal Kundala would be tremendously influenced by, if you're I believe there would be many non Bengali speakers. Kapal Kundala has been translated into many languages, including English. There are easily available translation of English. Kapal Kundala, again, a very popular novel by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay before Anandamot, which was greatly inspired by Shakespeare's Tempest. And in almost every chapter of the book, if you read the novel, every chapter of the book begins with a quotation either from Shakespeare or from Marlowe or that begins in English, of course, or in any other writings. But his commitment to English literary studies did not really stop him to think about India as a nation. Rather, it inspired him to construct India as a nation, and that's why we still call him the first nation builder of India. Not, mind you, not really a politician. The man who was serving the British Empire during the daytime. He was the deputy magistrate in the British Empire, all of you know. The man who was serving the British Empire during the daytime would be thinking about his motherland during the night. His Krishna Charitro, character of Krishna, Lord Krishna, his idea of Lord Krishna, I think quite well known to all of you, how he wanted to have someone like Lord Krishna emerging as an Indian leader, quite, intelligent, macho, and how he can manipulate situations. So Bankim Chandra's Lord Krishna would be, in that sense, reimagination of the mythological Krishna that we have in the great epic of Mahabharata. So it was I think this is again discussed quite elaborately by Sudipto Kaviraj in his book, and also by Partho Chatterjee. We are all thinking about how Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay would be constructing India as a nation. Again, I repeat, this man who was being inspired by English literary studies. And then we come to the next one, and I think I should have talked about Michael Madhusudan Dutta once again to begin with, but because of the paucity of time, I would not be able to. Again, it's a very interesting case for Michael Madhusudan Dutta, who relinquished everything that was Indian, including his religion. Wanted to look like a brown sahib, wanted to look like a sahib, you would be speaking like an English sahib, and would be writing, would be even would be writing in English. He hated to write in his mother tongue. And the poetry that Michael Madhusudan Datta would be producing in the beginning of his life in early 40s, early 1840s, uh, let me tell you, would be quite great. But he was not given any kind of recognition as an English writer. But look at what happened to him the moment he started writing in Bangla. Only for one particular writing, Meghnad Bodh Kabbo, slaying of the Meghnad, would be, I think, known to all of us. Again, reimagination of the character of Meghnad and Ravana. You know, uh, Probably in today's context, Michael Madhusudan Datta would be the most hated writer, because he is in a sense completely reversing that discourse about Lord Rama, while Lord Rama is, in a sense portrayed as a villain, as a beggar Rama who is begging in front of Ravan for his wife, and where Meghnad and Ravanas became heroes for Michael Madhusudan Datta. Is a complete reversal of the myth, complete reversal of the traditional belief, many would be calling in Hinduism. But look at the level of tolerance among the 19th century intellectuals. Nothing was done to Michael Madhusudan Datta. People would be talking about this writing, people would be really discussing about that, but nobody was pelting stones at Michael Madhusudan Datta. Nobody was even trying to attack him any ways. Rather, he had tremendous friends in Vidyasagar who believed in a different kind of idea altogether. So this was the kind of world that we had in the beginning of the 19th century. And since the time is quite less, let me sort of now uh, go to Tagore himself. I mean, without discussing about Tagore, how can we think about India as a nation, and how English literature or English literary studies would be pivotal in forming India as a nation. Now, very interestingly, when Tagore started his career as a writer, the first major writing of Tagore would be, again, known as Shonatturi in Bangla and Golden Boat in English, highly popular among uh, world academia. All of you know that this would be one of the pivotal books in South Asia studies in almost all the American universities dealing with South Asia studies. Tagore would be studied quite extensively, uh, including Harvard and UC Berkeley, the two topmost universities. In fact, in University of California, Berkeley, there is a Tagore Study Center where Tagore is being now studied extensively. And one of my illustrious colleagues, Professor Sukanta Choudhury, would be delivering lectures on Tagore at University of California, Berkeley, almost regularly. So Tagore, we may not be really very interested in Tagore, but Americans are quite interested in Tagore at this point in time. I mean, and that's what I mentioned. So Tagore started his career uh, with this major publication called Golden Boat in 1891 that distinctly talk about India as a nation. So Tagore, as you know, that did not have any formal education, and that would be really the boon for Tagore. And the idea of India as a nation would be now moving in a completely different direction. Tagore, as I mentioned, though, would be interested in knowing of the events of the Indian National Congress, but he was at the same time was one of the bitterest critics of Indian National Congress, almost a kind of love-hate relationship that Tagore had with Indian National Congress. He could not come to terms with the kind of attitude that this mendicant Indian Nationalist Congress leaders, largely the Indian version of English bourgeoisie, they would be taking most of the time. As I mentioned, that they were largely English educated, gentlemen led by Dadabhai Naoroji, who incidentally went to become the first, MP from Asia in a British Parliament. So he was again a brown Sahib. Tagore would not agree with the kind of uh, petitioning, the kind of collaborative attitude that Indian National Congress showed in the beginning of its formation. And there are innumerable poems, especially in his first collection of poems called Manushi. In fact, incidentally, Manushi was written largely in Gazipur, again, one of the very famous districts of UP now, and Gazipur, all of you might be knowing that Gazipur was really famous for two reasons at that point of time. Gazipur would be producing, uh, I think, beautiful roses, and Gazipur would be also producing opium. So Gazipur was, though it was not really a very happening colonial town, but it was quite known to the British colonizers for these reasons that Tagore was attracted by the beautiful roses and the connection that Gazipur had with the last independent ruler of Bengal, Sirajuddaulah. He had a tremendous connection with Gazipur. Sirajuddaulah was quite fond of those beautiful roses, and people would be bringing roses from Gazipur to Bengal for the last independent ruler. And Manushi, in many senses, is a kind of tribute to the last independent ruler of Bengal by Tagore. Tagore was quite fond of this last independent ruler. You can understand what Tagore was trying to say. He was trying to basically say that India or Bengal at that point of time lacked this kind of a ruler, this kind of a nationalist, this kind of a warrior. This was a fitting tribute to the entire series of poem called Manushi is a fitting tribute to that last independent ruler. And thereafter you have what I'm mentioning, Golden Boat, Shonaturi, which was written after having, in a sense, disenchanted stint with the Indian National Congress. The kind of India that they were trying to build was almost urban-centric, metropolitan, bourgeois kind of an India. Tagore could not come to terms with that. Tagore did not agree with them, and he went to the extreme part of Bengal, now known as Bangladesh. He started living in Shilaidaho after 1891, and because of his proximity with the people there, Tagore for the first time witnessed real India, the kind of people, the kind of poverty that India was going through, the India had to witness. He had almost a kind of revelation about India, which he did not really find in the urban centers where he was living at that point of time in Calcutta. So when he landed up in Shilaidaho, now in Bangladesh, he could understand that the British government had actually done nothing for this real India. And I think Shonaturi or Golden Boat, the people who are described in these poems, look at the people who are the heroes and heroines of Tagore's Shonaturi. They are the peasants, they are the farmers, they are the have-nots struggling to meet both ends. In many senses, people might argue that Tagore is actually imitating English romantics. Almost you can possibly call this is a romantic nationalism that Tagore was trying to build since 1891. But he was deeply aware of what he was doing by extending the idea of India, as in fact, exactly 100 years ago, the British romantic writers were trying to extend the idea of England as a nation. All of you know that, how the British romantic writers were influenced by the French Revolution and what they were trying to do in their writings to begin with, especially during the 1790s, both Wordsworth, Coleridge, and then of course Sade. They were rebels at home. They understood that the kind of England that we have, that the idea of England, English nation, is severely incomplete. It is brutal on certain sections of the society. All of you know that the working class did not have any voting rights. The women did not have any voting rights. That's the story about the most civilized nation under the sun. But that's besides the point. That the most civilized nation under the sun, which ruled the world for nearly 200 years, almost 70% of the earth for 200 years, did not extend the voting rights to either the working class or the women. The Romantics were fighting against these, in a sense, inadequate representation of English democracy. Exactly 100 years before, Tagore was doing the same thing in India in 1890s. For Tagore, writing, thinking about the people living in the rural parts of the India, I think would be a conscious endeavor to extend the idea of India itself, you know, to, in a sense, reach to the last man in the periphery. I really, really, I would have liked to sort of go on, but I have barely 3 to 4 minutes to go. We'll have to come back to what I thought of doing in the beginning, what is happening in the contemporary world, contemporary time. Again, in many ways, ironically, we are going back to the early part of the 19th century, where the British wanted to divide us in communal life. Okay, again, playing with your personal life, your emotion, your identity, which is not really built on your political identity, but on your cultural identity, on your religious identity, right? And if you think about, since I was mentioning about Tagore, if you think about Tagore uh, as one of the founding fathers of India's nation, if you think about Gandhi as one of the founding fathers of India's nation, incidentally, Tagore and Gandhi had a tremendous friendship, a lifelong friendship that you had since 1915. Many of you might be knowing that when Gandhi came back to India permanently in 1915, the first place that he visited would be Shantiniketan. He wanted to visit Tagore. Why? Did he want to read Tagore's poetry? Did he want to discuss poetry with Tagore? The answer is clear no. Gandhi knew what he was doing. Gandhi knew that this is the man. This was the man that know India. This was the man that understands India. And on every other, political movement that Gandhi would be taking after 1920, Gandhi started to become popular only after 1920. Gandhi would seek Tagore's advice, whether it is the non-cooperation movement, whether it is the SALT movement, wherever. Before undertaking any major movement, Gandhi would be taking advice of what he would be calling his Gurudev. That's the way he was addressing Tagore, right? And very interestingly, Tagore would rarely agree with Gandhi's idea of non-cooperation movement. By the time, of course, Tagore had a completely different idea about India. Tagore had a tremendous change of mind, and that started to take place after 1910, and that's obviously a different story altogether. Again, I don't have any time to discuss about that. Tagore had a tremendous change of heart after 1910, and of course, after he got the Nobel Prize, Tagore started to think about India completely in a different direction. But till 1910, I mean, the kind of India that Tagore would be talking about, I think, pathetically missing in today's India. Again, most of our politicians, whether big or small, are, I think, quite fond of Tagore. I mean, incessantly they would be quoting Tagore, of course, during the election times, especially from his Gitanjali, or Bangla or English Gitanjali, which got the Nobel Prize. But do we really understand this man? You know, you know, some of our great political persons of the time was perhaps ruling the state, ruling the country, would be continuously talking about Tagore's poem known as Bharat Tirtha in Bangla, India as a pilgrimage, almost all the time. Incidentally, they'll be quoting that particular poem without really understanding the meaning in that particular poem, how Tagore conceived India as a nation which had sheltered people from all across the globe, whether they are coming from, different different religion, different ideas. India is like a pilgrimage. In Bangla it is called দেবে আর নেবে মেলাবে মেলেবে যাবে না ফিরে এই ভারতের মহামানবের সাগর তীরে. It's barely I can translate it for you. That people will come and go, live in India, but they will ultimately make India as their second home. Are we really succeeding this dream of this great man, or are we really failing this great thinker of India, who was so revered, admired by none other than the father of Indian nation, or father of Indian nationalism, Mahatma Gandhi? With this question, I would like to end my lecture. Thank you so much.
Dear participants, you can type your questions in the comment section for the question answer session.
अभी क्या होने में इधर से शो कर दूँ अभी जो मैं कैमरा उठाऊँ
Dear participants, we are waiting for the questions. If you have.
आप कोड ऑफ थैंक्स के लिए बोलिए क्वेश्चन आएंगे तुम शो कर देंगे बोलिए हम सर कौन हैं
Okay, thank you, Professor Manojit Mandal. You accepted our invitation and spare times for us from your busy schedule. It was a really thought-provoking and insightful lecture, especially your this statement. There's no great nationality without literature. There's no great literature without nationality, and the efforts of Bankim Chand Chatterjee in colonial India. In fact, I can say it, you have broadcasted all the colonial period before our eyes. Now, I would like to invite Dr. H.M. Arif Nadvi, Head of the Department of Languages, to give a vote of thanks to our guest or participants. So please.
Thank you, Dr. Arina. A very, very gracious good afternoon to all. Honorable Chancellor Sir, Professor S.W. Akhtar, Pro-Chancellor Sir, Javed Nateem Akhtar Sir, Vice Chancellor, Professor Javed Musarras Sir, Registrar Sir, Professor Haris Sir, and our Honorable expert speaker of the first day of this international faculty development program organized by the Department of Languages Integral University. Our participants, truly lovers of literature from across the country and abroad, and our colleagues and deans, directors, heads of Integral University. The moment is a great honor for me to propose vote of thanks. So, one couplet in Urdu I would like to recite. हर तरह की बेसरो सामानियों के बावजूद, सर, हर तरह की बेसरो सामानियों के बावजूद आज वो आया तो मुझको अपना घर अच्छा लगा.
Wow, wow.
So, thank you, sir. Special thanks to our guest speaker, very learned speaker in all respects. And first of all, thanks for accepting an invitation in a very short notice. And thanks for his your thoughts, your speech, bits by bits, and arguments by arguments. Definitely, this lecture, sir, went a long way in explaining in easy to understand ways, and really you stressed on the importance of the topic. Again, thank you, sir. I am very humble to present humble words before you. Please accept the greetings of the day. मेरा शुक्रिया कबूल कीजिए. Thank you, sir. And then to our participants, I would like to present my sincere thanks to my अदब के परवाने, अदब के परवाने, क्षमा के परवाने. They are lovers, you are really lovers of literature. And you know, I'm speaking to my dear participants that there is one saying in Arabic that goes, Man lam yashkurin nas, lam yashkurillah. He who doesn't thank the people is not thankful to the Almighty. So it is mandatory, it is moral obligation to thank the participants who are our dedicated participants. And to my participants, really you are in fact the mirror bearers, since literature is the mirror to the society. This is the responsibility on the shoulders of our participants to hand over this torch, this shama, to the generations to come. I would like to give sincere thanks to Dr. Arina Nazneen, convener for his program, for introductory address in a very, I think, in a very comprehensive way. And next to Dr. Arshi Khan, who is our colleague as well, for the welcome note that really provided with the literary momentum to this important event. And our colleague, very important colleague, to Dr. Vania, to be Dr. Vania. Okay, so the co-convener who has been making dedicated efforts, sincere efforts to approach each and every participant to make this IFDP a successful event. A sincere thanks to her. And many thanks to the organizing committee of the department, who are actually the backbone of this virtual meeting. And I would like to appreciate, I would like to salute their cooperation and all-round support. And so I'm briefing and I'm concluding. And again, and last to I coordinator, Dr. Usmani sir, who has been playing a very key, very important key role to make this event approachable to each and every participant. So, with these humble comments, I am leaving with this couplet तुम्हारे साथ ये मौसम फरिश्तों जैसा है, तुम्हारे बाद ये मौसम बहुत सताएगा। थैंक यू सर, थैंक यू अगेन,
Thank you so much.
थैंक यू सर।
I'll take my leave. Thank you so much for your nice words. So can I leave now?
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Can I leave now?
dear participants. You all have been added to our Learning Management System Integral Learning Initiative, ILI. From time to time, you receive some assignments through it that is mandatory to submit for the successful accomplishment of this program. If you have any query, do WhatsApp in the group. Dear participants, you have been a source of inspiration for us. So keep connecting us for tomorrow's session. You would be informed through WhatsApp. Keep watching us. Have a nice day.